Once again, I'm going to have to make modifications to an area of the ship. This time, I'm working on the aft superstructure. Following the advice from the HMS Hood Association for this kit, I'll be removing these blocks, close these windows, and open this doorway. The aft superstructure will also be augmented with photo etch from the FlyHawk Super Detail Upgrade Kit and resin components for these searchlight platforms that come from the Super Detail Upgrade Kit's Detail Upgrade Kit. And the gun director will be replaced with a MicroMaster 3D printed component. It's going to take me a few videos to complete the aft superstructure. In this video, I will prepare the plastic components and do the modifications that are recommended by the HMS Hood Association. I'm taking a close look at these components while I remove them from their sprue. I'm mostly looking for flashing. There's only rarely flashing on part 13, that shouldn't be too difficult to remove, but I'm also looking at some of the details. I can see that on one of the portholes, a wriggle is missing. You can also see that these wriggles are going to be very difficult to preserve when removing details like the hatches and these blocks. That means I'm going to have to replace all the wriggles on this structure with photo etch. That's not a problem, I have enough to do that, I think. Other than that, I don't think these components will cause me too much trouble. After doing some basic cleaning up of the components with a file, I can move on to the modifications. On the platform, there are support struts underneath the platforms for the searchlights. Those are going to be replaced with photo etch, so they can be removed. A file will do that quite easily. That's all that needs to be done on this component, so I'll move on to the more trickier modifications that need to be made to the sides. Starting with the simpler side, here there's just one box that I need to remove. To remove this box, I'm going to start with a fine saw. A saw is the best tool for this job. A knife or clippers will push plastic out of the way and deform it, whereas at least a saw will grind it out of the way and make a gap for itself. Moving on to the port side, it has the same box at the top that needs to be removed. It's going to be done in much the same way. It's the lower box that concerns me more because there's a slight overhang that needs to be retained. But at least for this upper box, it comes out easily enough. Okay, now to tackle this lower box. No matter how I try and do this, I think there is going to be a small corner that is going to be left behind that I'm going to have to snap off from the end anyway. So what I'm going to try and do is cut on 3 axes up until that corner where it overhangs and then snap it off and hope that it removes most of the plastic cleanly or at least doesn't cause any damage. The first cut that I make goes into the structure from the port side, the starboard side. The second cut starts aft and goes forward. And the third cut, which is the smallest of the cut, is parallel to the deck. Just need to go in far enough such that that corner doesn't get snapped off when I try and remove this block. As expected, there's still a little bit of plastic at the back holding the block in place, so I grab the block with pliers and snap it off. It seems to have come off fairly cleanly. That's positive. Now to clean this up, I wasn't able to saw these boxes off perfectly, and there are other details like ladders and hatches that also need to be removed. To get this task done, I do whatever is necessary. Bar files, round files, blades, whatever I can to reduce that plastic and smooth it out as much as possible. At this point, I have resolved to not try and preserve any detail here, like the wriggles, so if they get damaged, it doesn't matter. I'm just trying to get as clean a look as possible. Working in constrained spaces like this is quite difficult. There's not much room to move the file around, which means it takes a long time to file with anything. That does tend to make me a bit impatient, so I put on more pressure than I should, and that leaves deep scratches in the plastic. While that is not ideal, it is something that I can correct later with Surfacer. At this point, I just want to get a surface that is reasonably flat. Moving back to the port component, I need to deal with that bit of plastic that got left behind when I snapped off this block. Once again, I'm finding a use for my chisel blades. I don't use these things often, but this is definitely a case where it'll be helpful, although I do find myself wishing it was a bit narrower. Nevertheless, I am able to get most of the remaining plastic out, and I get a good clean corner in there. Removing the plastic ladder itself also presents a bit of a problem. Once again, it's very difficult to get into this place. This is an even more constrained space than the upper level, and there is this corner of the overhang that I need to protect as well. The best tool that I found to remove this ladder was the tip of the round file. During this process, the inner corner of this area did lose a bit of definition, so I reached for my secondary set of files, which has a lot of options, some with some pretty sharp tips that I can use to re-dig that corner into the plastic. At this point, I think the shape is quite good, but it's something that I'll only be able to know for sure once I apply Surfacer. But before I can do that, I need to fill these holes. The first holes that I'm going to fill are the easiest. Those are the windows. To fill them, I'm using extra thick super glue. I apply masking tape to the outside of the component to ensure that the glue doesn't seep all the way through, and then simply fill the windows with extra thick super glue. After leaving the super glue to set, I can then remove the tape. Tape comes off quite easily. A little bit of residue is left behind glued to the super glue, which can easily be removed using a file and sandpaper. Although having tape to hold back the glue has left the finish quite good, the super glue does tend to bulge out a little bit, so I'm going to need to file this down to get it smooth. A little bit of filing and sanding is enough to get it into a state that I think is acceptable, but I'm not going to know for sure until I apply Surfacer. Now that the windows are dealt with, let's move on to the gaps left from removing the boxes. These just need to be filled with plastic stock. I select plastic stock of whatever size will fill the gap, cut off sections, and tack them in place using extra thick plastic cement. Once correctly positioned, I reinforce the bond with extra thin plastic cement. While the patchwork to fill the holes is drying, I'm going to remove the plastic in the middle of these doors. I just need to be careful not to bump the sections of plastic that I just installed. Fortunately, it's not too difficult to avoid them. First, I drill 2 holes in the center of the door, then open up those holes with a blade, and once the hole is large enough to get the round file in, I use a round file to shape the edge to meet the frame of the door. That is a pretty simple modification. Now that the glue holding the patches in place is sufficiently dry, I can apply plastic putty. Plastic putty will fill the gaps around the patches, allowing me to blend it in with the existing plastic. I also take this opportunity to put a thin layer of putty on top of the windows that I had filled in. I don't expect much of this putty to be retained. I'm really using it as an indicator to tell me if I've sufficiently sanded this area such that it is flat. If when sanding off this putty, the windows show first, then I know that they are still sticking out of the side of the bulkhead. If when sanding it off, I just see white windows appear, then I know there was actually a cavity. I don't expect that to happen. And if everything is perfectly level, which I also doubt is the case, then clear windows set in grey bulkheads will appear at the same time. Now that the putty is dried, the excess can be removed. Starting with a file, I remove the bulk of the excess, and then I work it down with various grits of sandpaper. In constrained areas like this, it's very difficult to get a sanding sponge in, so I'm gripping a sheet of 400 grit sandpaper using locking tweezers, and that gets the job done fairly well. The final finish is going to be achieved using Surfacer, so if there are fairly deep scratches in this area, I'm not concerned. Surfacer will be able to fill them. The most important thing that I'm looking for is that the surfaces are level and that the shape is correct. Now that I'm done with the filing and sanding, I'll put on the first layer of Surfacer, and I'm quite happy with it actually. The only area that I'm not happy with is this upper corner of that lower gap where I removed the block. There is a bit of extra plastic in there that needs to be cut out. Everywhere else, it's actually really good. Just some minor touch up here and there which I can fix with a little bit of sandpaper. So after giving the Surfacer some time to dry, I then cut out a deeper groove into the upper corner of that box and then respray the components with Surfacer. Once the Surfacer has dried, construction can begin. As usual, I tack the components together using extra thick plastic cement. Once tacked in place, I reinforce the bonds with extra thin plastic cement. While the glue is wet and to ensure as good a fit with the model as possible, I place the components onto the deck in the location where they will be installed and hold them together while I apply the glue. Since the aft superstructure will be entirely constructed before it is glued onto the deck, I want to be sure that it will go in place without any trouble. I don't want to be fighting a component to get it into place when it is full of delicate details. Once the glue holding the components together has dried, I apply a layer of putty. You might be thinking that I'm not doing this in the optimal order. I could have glued all these components together and done the modifications and then done one round of applying putty. I was just concerned that due to the tricky location of some of the modifications, that it would become a bit difficult if I were to do it all at once. So I've decided to rather do this in stages. There's actually going to be a third stage of this when I glue the deck in on top. But for now, I'm just filling in all these gaps, gluing these panels together. Without the deck on, which has a bit of an overhang, it allows me to have easy access to all of these lines for me to clean them up. Once again, after the putty is dried, I then file and sand off the excess, and then spray the component with surfacer. Now that I'm happy with the sides of the structure, I can glue on the platform. Yet again, I tack the component in place using extra thick plastic cement, and then once correctly positioned, I glue it down using extra thin plastic cement. In this case, to fill these gaps, I'm not going to use putty. That's because it's a very small area where I want more control, and I found that plastic putty dries too quickly and becomes crumbly, and it becomes a bit difficult to direct it to the exact positions that I want it in. So in this case, to fill the gaps at the base of the frames between the windows, I use extra thick super glue. This allows me to place a very small drop of glue in a very precise position that will fill the gap at the base of the frame without ingressing into the area of the window. After all, I do want to maintain clean corners for the window. The platform itself has one small modification that needs to be made to it. That is, the splinter shield between the two searchlight platforms needs to be raised slightly. In this case, I'm using a 1mm thick piece of styrene stock. After all the glue and putty has dried, it can then be removed. First, I file off the majority of the excess, and then remove the larger scratches using a 400 grit sanding sponge. Once all of that is done, yet another layer of surfacer is sprayed onto the components, and I'm finally happy with the quality of the finish. This completes the basic work for the aft superstructure. In the next video, I'll start adding details back onto it by installing hatches and wriggles for the portholes. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.